On the morning of December 8, 1982, phones started ringing off the hook on the trading floor at Warner Communications in New York. Warner had just told the market that its earnings for the last 3 months of the year would fall far short of what everyone expected, and the reason was one subsidiary, a video game company that, 18 months earlier, had been called the fastest-growing company in the history of American business. Within hours, Warner stock had lost nearly a third of its value. Traders were shouting. Executives were fielding calls they had no good answers for. And in the middle of that chaos, it later came out that the man running the video game company and one of his own vice presidents had quietly sold their own shares less than an hour before the bad news went public. That company was Atari. 3 years earlier, in a much smaller and much quieter room, 4 young programmers had sat across a desk from that same executive and asked for something simple: credit and a fair cut of the money their games were making. What he told them that day, and what he did afterward, set in motion the exact chain of events that would come crashing down on that trading floor in 1982. This is the story of a company that invented an entire industry, dominated it more completely than almost any company has ever dominated anything, and then, through one decision about how it treated the people who made its products, built the very rival that would help tear that industry and itself apart. The company began in June of 1972, founded by 2 engineers named Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, working out of a converted skating rink and later a small rented office in Sunnyvale, California. Their first product was a simple arcade machine called Pong, 2 rectangles and a square dot bouncing between them, and it became an unlikely sensation, first in a single bar in California, where the machine reportedly jammed with coins within days of being installed. Bushnell was a showman as much as an engineer, and he understood something few people in electronics understood yet: that a game did not need to be complicated to be addictive. It just needed to be instantly understandable and slightly harder to master than it looked. By 1976, the young company needed serious capital to build something bigger than an arcade cabinet, a machine that could bring that same experience into people's living rooms, plugged into their own television sets. Bushnell, who owned the company outright, sold it that year to the media conglomerate Warner Communications for $28 million, staying on to run it with fresh corporate backing behind him. The following year, that living room machine arrived. It was called the Atari Video Computer System, later renamed the Atari 2600, a plain wood-grained box with swappable plastic cartridges, and it would turn out to be one of the most consequential pieces of plastic and silicon ever sold to an American household. What happened next was one of the fastest corporate expansions in American history. The Atari 2600 did not just sell, it saturated. Millions of the consoles found their way into homes across the country, and by the early 1980s, industry watchers were calling Atari the fastest-growing company the United States had ever produced, its revenue climbing past $2 billion a year. At its peak, the company controlled somewhere between 3/4 and 4/5 of the entire home video game market, a level of dominance that almost no company in any consumer electronics category has matched before or since. Atari alone was generating something close to a third of the entire profit of Warner Communications, a media giant that also owned record labels and film studios. The word Atari had become, for millions of American families, simply the word for video games themselves, the way some people say a brand name for a product category. Children lined up at stores when new cartridges shipped. Parents budgeted for the console the way they budgeted for a refrigerator. And inside the company's California offices, engineers worked in an atmosphere the outside world found almost mythical, young, brilliant, and mostly left alone to build whatever strange and inventive thing they could dream up on a system with less processing power than a modern digital watch. It felt, to nearly everyone involved, like the beginning of something that would only ever keep growing. The turning point did not look like one at the time. In November of 1978, Warner's leadership pushed Bushnell out of the company he had founded, partly over a genuine disagreement about strategy. Bushnell wanted to retire the 2600 quickly and replace it with a more advanced successor, while Warner's executives believed the console still had years of profit left in it and wanted to keep selling it as is. Warner won that argument, installed a former textile industry executive named Ray Kassar as the new chief executive, and kept the 2600 in production for years to come. The very same machine that would later become the battleground for everything that went wrong. Then, in May of 1979, 4 of Atari's own programmers, David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead, walked into a meeting with Kassar. Between them, they had written games responsible for roughly 60% of Atari's cartridge sales the previous year, on salaries of about $22,000, with no royalties and no public credit. They asked for a cut of what their own work was earning the company. According to accounts from people who worked there, Kassar dismissed them, comparing their value to the company to that of the anonymous worker on an assembly line who happened to be the one putting the finished cartridges into their boxes. 5 months later, all 4 men quit and founded their own company to make games for the very console they had just been building for someone else. That new company was called Activision, and it was the first independent third-party video game studio the world had ever seen. Atari sued them almost immediately, claiming theft of trade secrets, but there was no real legal ground to stand on. Nothing prevented someone from studying how the 2600 worked and simply writing new games for it, because no one had ever needed a law like that before, since no outside company had ever tried. Activision's games sold well. That success proved something Atari had never planned for, that anyone with the technical knowledge could build for its console without Atari's permission, without a licensing fee, and without a single quality check from the company whose name was stamped on the front of the box. From Atari's point of view at the time, refusing those 4 programmers, a raise had seemed like ordinary, defensible business, protecting margins, treating salaried engineers the way salaried engineers at any large company were treated. Nobody in that meeting room in 1979 was thinking about industry structure, but that single decision, multiplied by the fact that Atari had built an open, unlocked platform with no gatekeeping mechanism at all, meant there was now a proven blueprint for outsiders to profit from Atari's console, and absolutely nothing standing between that blueprint and anyone else who wanted to copy it. The Empire's greatest strength, an open system that any developer could write for, was about to become the exact opening its imitators would pour through. By 1982, more than 20 companies were publishing games for the Atari 2600. From serious studios like Activision down to household names with no game development experience at all, cereal companies and cosmetics companies among them, all racing to cash in before the window closed. Atari had no licensing system, no approval process, and no way to stop any of it. Store shelves filled with cartridges of wildly uncertain quality, and consumers, unable to tell a carefully built game from a rushed one, increasingly assumed the worst about anything wearing Atari's name. Inside Atari's own walls, the same overconfidence was making things worse. That year, the company manufactured somewhere around 12 million cartridges of a home version of Pac-Man, based on an outside analyst's prediction that it would sell 9 million copies, even though only somewhere between 7 and 10 million of Atari's consoles actually existed in American homes to play it on. Real sales came in far short of that target, and the cartridge would not sell its 8 millionth copy until 1990, 8 years later. That same year, under enormous pressure to have a Christmas blockbuster, Atari licensed a major movie property and had a single programmer build the tie-in game in barely 5 weeks, a decision made under deadline pressure so severe that quality was never seriously in the conversation. Warehouses across the country were quietly filling with cartridges nobody wanted. On December 8, 1982, Warner Communications told investors that Atari's sales for the final quarter of the year would fall dramatically short of projections. Warner's stock price dropped by roughly a third that single day. It later emerged that Ray Kassar had sold 5,000 of his own shares less than an hour before that announcement became public, and that another Atari vice president had done the same. The following year, the Securities and Exchange Commission formally accused both men of trading on inside information. Kassar settled by repaying just over $81,000 in profits, without admitting or denying wrongdoing. By the middle of 1983, Atari had already lost $356 million and laid off nearly a third of its 10,000 employees, shifting most of its manufacturing overseas. By the end of that year, the annual loss had climbed past $536 million, and the company's share of a shrinking market had fallen to roughly 40%. Across the entire American video game industry, not just at Atari, annual revenue collapsed from around $3.2 billion in 1983 to somewhere near $100 million by 1985, a decline of almost 97% in barely 2 years. An industry that Atari had built almost single-handedly a decade earlier had nearly ceased to exist, and Atari, its largest and most dominant player, absorbed the worst of the fall. In July of 1984, Warner Communications sold what remained of Atari's home console and computer business to Jack Tramiel, who had just left the computer company Commodore, for $240 million, paid almost entirely in notes and future stock rather than cash up front. A company that 18 months earlier had been worth billions and had generated a third of its parent's profits was handed over for a fraction of that, renamed Atari Corporation, and left to survive as a much smaller business under new ownership. Meanwhile, a different company was studying exactly what had gone wrong. When Nintendo launched its own console in the United States the following year, it built an entire structure specifically designed to prevent Atari's collapse from ever happening to it. A hardware chip physically locking out any cartridge that had not been licensed, a public-facing seal of quality stamped on every approved game box, and a contract limiting how many titles any outside publisher could release in a single year. Where Atari had let anyone build for its machine with zero oversight, Nintendo built a closed, tightly controlled garden, and it became the dominant console maker of the following decade, almost entirely on the strength of solving the exact problem that had destroyed the company that came before it. The lesson of Atari is not simply that a bad video game ended a company, or that overproduction sank an industry, although both of those things genuinely happened. The deeper lesson sits back in that quiet meeting room in May of 1979, the one nobody outside the company even knew about at the time. Atari built the most open, permissive platform in the history of consumer electronics up to that point, and that openness was precisely why it grew so fast. Anyone could write for it, anyone could build on it, and ideas could flow in from everywhere. But a system with no gate has no way to close itself when the people flowing through that gate stop acting in its interest. When Atari told its own most valuable creators that they were as replaceable as anonymous factory labor, it did not just lose 4 employees. It manufactured the proof of concept for an entire industry of outside developers who would soon flood its platform with no one checking their work at all. The same openness that built Atari's empire, once combined with a leadership team that treated its creative talent as interchangeable, became the crack that an unregulated flood of third-party garbage would later pour straight through. 3 years after that meeting, the bill for it landed on a trading floor in New York, and nobody there could have told you it started with 4 programmers asking, politely, to be paid fairly for what they had already built. If you want to understand how the companies that build entire industries can end up destroying them from the inside, this channel exists for exactly that kind of story, told again, company after company, warning after warning. Subscribe if you want the next one when it lands. And down in the comments, tell me this. If you ever plugged a joystick into an old console and blew dust out of a cartridge before it would load, what do you remember most? The games that worked, or the ones that clearly should never have been allowed on the shelf? I read every comment, and this is Toppled Empires.